The blood-red sunset painted the dusty horizon as Ethan Powell dragged himself toward the weathered farmhouse, his shadow stretching long across the barren Texas soil. His muscles screamed with each step, 30 years of hard labor etched into every line of his sun-beaten face. The year was 1876, and Wilson, Texas, had never been kind to those who couldn't keep up. Ethan had spent 14 hours clearing new acreage, fighting the stubborn mesquite trees that seemed determined to reclaim every inch of land he'd worked to tame. His shirt clung to his back, soaked through with sweat and streaked with dirt. The pain that had started as a dull ache at dawn now radiated up his spine like lightning. He hadn't always been alone in this struggle. 3 years ago, the influenza that swept through Wilson had taken his wife Sarah, leaving him to raise their daughter alone. The farm that had once been their shared dream had become his burden, a promise he couldn't bear to break. As he approached the porch, he spotted Margaret Thompson, the schoolteacher who'd moved to Wilson 6 months ago. She sat on his porch steps, deep in conversation with his 15-year-old daughter Hannah. The sight stopped him in his tracks. Margaret's chestnut hair caught the dying sunlight, her simple blue dress a stark contrast to the dusty browns of his property. "Mr. Powell," Margaret called, rising to her feet. "Hannah invited me for supper. I hope that's all right." Ethan nodded, momentarily forgetting the pain in his back. At 38, he'd convinced himself that loneliness was just another condition of life, like the drought or the relentless sun. But something about Margaret's presence made the farmhouse look less worn, the land less unforgiving. "Hannah's been telling me about your plans to expand the wheat field," Margaret said, her green eyes studying him with concern. "You look exhausted." "Work doesn't wait for rest, Miss Thompson," Ethan replied, attempting to straighten his posture despite the protest from his spine. "Papa's been working since before sunrise," Hannah explained, her young face serious beyond her years. "He never stops." Margaret stepped forward, her expression resolute. "Mr. Powell, even the hardest working men need rest. The chores will wait until tomorrow." Ethan opened his mouth to object, but a sharp pain lanced through his lower back, forcing him to grip the porch railing. Margaret was at his side instantly, her arm around his waist providing unexpected support. "Hannah, heat some water," Margaret instructed. "Your father needs to rest." "I can't afford rest," Ethan protested as Margaret guided him inside. "The crops won't plant themselves, and we'll lose everything if I don't." "You'll lose everything if you work yourself to death," Margaret interrupted firmly. "One night of rest won't ruin you." Too exhausted to argue, Ethan allowed himself to be led to his chair by the hearth. As Hannah busied herself with heating water and Margaret moved confidently around his kitchen, he found himself watching her with curiosity. In Wilson, unmarried women typically kept their distance from widowers, wary of gossip, but Margaret Thompson seemed unbothered by convention. "Why are you helping me?" he asked as she placed a steaming cup of willow bark tea in his calloused hands. Margaret's smile held no pity, only understanding. "Because everyone needs someone to remind them that they're human, Mr. Powell, even the strongest among us." That night, as pain kept him from sleep, Ethan found himself thinking not of the unfinished work waiting outside, but of the schoolteacher with kind eyes who had dared to tell him to rest. The following morning, Ethan woke with the sun, as was his habit. His back still ached, but the sharp, stabbing pain had subsided to a dull throb. He made his way carefully to the kitchen, surprised to find Hannah already up, preparing breakfast. "You're supposed to be resting, Papa," she said, her brow furrowed in concern. "Can't rest while there's daylight burning," Ethan replied, reaching for his boots. "The north field needs clearing before I can plant." Hannah put down the spoon she was holding and faced her father. "Miss Thompson said you'd say that. She also said to tell you she's coming back this afternoon to check on you, and if you've made your back worse, she'll have Dr. Simmons confine you to bed." Ethan paused. "She said that, did she?" Hannah nodded, her expression serious. "She cares, Papa, not many people do anymore." The truth in his daughter's words struck Ethan hard. Since Sarah's death, the community had offered condolences and occasional help, but most had returned to their own concerns. Only the Reverend Jenkins checked in regularly, and that seemed more out of Christian duty than genuine care. "Miss Thompson is different," Hannah continued. "She asks about us, she listens." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. I appreciate her concern, but this farm won't run itself. We need the money from this year's crop if we're going to keep going. Then let me help more, Hannah insisted. I'm not a child anymore. You're helping plenty, Ethan said firmly. Your job is school and learning. Your mother would have wanted that. Hannah's eyes welled with tears at the mention of Sarah. Mama would have wanted you to take care of yourself too. Ethan felt his resolve weakening. Sarah had indeed often scolded him for working too hard, for putting the farm before his own well-being. She'd been the one who balanced him, who reminded him there was more to life than endless toil. I'll stick to lighter work today, he conceded. Just mending fences and checking on the livestock. Hannah's relief was evident as she returned to making breakfast. Ethan gazed out the window at his land, 160 acres of possibility and burden. He'd claimed it under the Homestead Act 12 years ago with nothing but determination and Sarah's unwavering faith in him. Now, with wheat prices falling and the bank loan coming due in 6 months, that determination was all he had left. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly. Ethan had managed to repair 2 sections of fence and check on the pregnant mare, but his back protested with every movement. He was heading to the well for water when he spotted a wagon approaching, dust billowing behind it. Margaret Thompson pulled the horse to a stop near the house, setting the brake before climbing down. She wore a practical riding skirt and a white blouse, her hair partially covered by a wide-brimmed hat. She carried a basket over one arm. "Miss Thompson," Ethan called, making his way toward her. "This is unexpected, is it?" she replied, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "I told Hannah I'd check on you. I'm a woman of my word, Mr. Powell." "Ethan," he corrected. "If you're going to make it your business to manage my health, you might as well use my given name." "Then you must call me Margaret," she replied, her green eyes meeting his directly. "And I've brought lunch. I thought perhaps you and Hannah might appreciate something you didn't have to prepare yourselves." Ethan glanced at the basket. "That's kind but unnecessary. We manage fine." "Of course you do," Margaret agreed, starting toward the house without waiting for further invitation. "But sometimes fine isn't enough. Sometimes people deserve a little better than fine." Ethan found himself following her, intrigued by her boldness. Most women in Wilson were reserved, especially around men they barely knew, but there was nothing coy about Margaret Thompson. Hannah emerged from the barn where she'd been feeding the chickens, her face lighting up at the sight of her teacher. "Miss Thompson, you came." "I said I would," Margaret replied warmly. "And I've brought a picnic. It's too beautiful a day to eat indoors." Soon they were seated beneath the large oak tree near the house, sharing cold chicken, cornbread, and fresh apple preserves. Margaret had even brought lemonade, a rare treat that made Hannah's eyes widen with delight. "This is wonderful," Hannah said between bites. "Isn't it, Papa?" Ethan nodded, surprised by how much he was enjoying the simple meal. "It's very good, thank you, Margaret." "You're welcome," Margaret replied, "though I must confess the preserves were made by Mrs. Wilson. My cooking skills are still developing." "You can't cook?" Ethan asked, surprised. Margaret laughed, the sound unexpectedly musical. "I can manage the basics, but I grew up in Boston. My father was a professor and we always had help in the kitchen. When I decided to become a teacher and move west, I had a lot to learn." "Why did you come to Wilson?" Hannah asked. "It's not exactly Boston." Margaret's expression grew more serious. "After the war, everything changed. My father died and my brother. Well, he never came home. Mother remarried, and her new husband had little use for a spinster stepdaughter with progressive ideas about education." "So you came to Texas?" Ethan asked, finding it hard to imagine this refined woman choosing the harsh frontier. "I wanted to go somewhere I could make a difference," Margaret explained. "The advertisement for a teacher in Wilson mentioned the town was growing, that there were families who wanted education for their children. It seemed like a place with possibility." Ethan studied her face, noting the determination beneath her gentle demeanor. "And has it met your expectations?" "Some days more than others," she answered honestly. "The children are wonderful. The town has been cautiously welcoming." "They're not used to independent women," Ethan observed. Margaret smiled. "No, they're not. But they're learning to adjust, as am I." After lunch, Margaret insisted on examining Ethan's back despite his protests. Her touch was professional but gentle as she pressed along his spine, asking where the pain was worst. You've strained the muscles severely, she concluded. My father suffered similar injuries. He was stubborn too, always refusing to rest until he could barely walk. I don't have the luxury of resting, Ethan explained. Every day I'm not working is money lost. Margaret considered this. What if you had help? Surely there are young men in town who could use the work. Ethan shook his head. Can't afford to pay wages. What about a work exchange? Hannah suggested suddenly. Like when the Millers helped the Johnsons with harvest and then the Johnsons helped them with barn raising. Margaret nodded approvingly. That's an excellent idea, Hannah. In fact, the Reverend was just saying last Sunday that the church youth group needs projects. They could help clear your north field as a service activity. I don't take charity, Ethan said stiffly. It's not charity, Margaret countered. It's community. And you can return the favor when you're healed by helping with repairs to the schoolhouse roof. It's been leaking since the spring storms. Ethan looked from Margaret to his daughter, seeing the same determined expression on both their faces. He thought of the north field, of how much faster the work would go with extra hands, of how it might mean the difference between meeting the bank payment or losing everything. I'll consider it, he said finally. Margaret's smile was warm with victory. Excellent, I'll speak with Reverend Jenkins tomorrow. As Margaret prepared to leave, Ethan walked her to her wagon, moving more carefully than he had that morning. Thank you for lunch, he said, and for your concern. It's been a while since anyone other than Hannah worried about me. Perhaps that's the problem, Margaret replied softly. Everyone needs someone to worry about them now and then. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a connection that went beyond mere friendliness. It unsettled and intrigued him simultaneously. Will you come for supper on Sunday? He asked impulsively. Hannah and I would enjoy the company. Margaret's eyes widened slightly in surprise before she smiled. I'd like that very much. As he watched her drive away, Ethan realized he was looking forward to Sunday with an anticipation that had nothing to do with rest or healing. For the first time in 3 years, he was simply looking forward to something. The Reverend Jenkins proved enthusiastic about Margaret's suggestion, and by Saturday morning, a group of 8 young men from the church arrived at Ethan's farm. Among them was Michael Rogers, the blacksmith's son, who seemed particularly attentive to Hannah. Ethan noted this with a father's concerned eye but focused on directing the work from the shade of a hastily constructed canopy. The boys worked with the energy of youth, clearing mesquite and rocks from the field with jokes and friendly competition. Ethan found himself both grateful for their help and frustrated by his own enforced idleness. He'd never been one to watch while others worked. It's killing you, isn't it? Margaret's voice came from behind him late in the morning. She'd arrived with a wagon of food and drink for the workers, her hair tied back with a simple ribbon. What is? Ethan asked, turning carefully to face her. Sitting here while they do the work, she replied, taking a seat beside him. I can see it in every line of your body, Ethan sighed. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's paying attention, she answered. My father was the same way. He believed a man's worth was measured by how much he could accomplish with his own 2 hands. Isn't it? Ethan asked. Margaret considered this. Partly perhaps, but I think there's value in knowing when to accept help too, in recognizing that no one does everything alone. I've been doing everything alone for 3 years, Ethan said quietly. No, Margaret corrected gently. You've had Hannah. And from what I can see, she's been carrying more weight than a girl her age should have to bear. Ethan felt a pang of guilt. It was true that since Sarah's death, Hannah had taken on many of her mother's responsibilities, cooking, cleaning, mending, all while maintaining her studies. He'd been so focused on keeping the farm going that he hadn't fully considered the burden he'd placed on his daughter. She never complains, he said. Of course not. She loves you, Margaret replied. She wants to help just like those boys out there want to help. The question is whether you can allow yourself to receive that help without feeling diminished by it. Ethan watched as the young men worked, their progress already impressive. At this rate, the field would be cleared in 2 days rather than the 2 weeks it would have taken him alone. I'm trying, he admitted. It doesn't come naturally, Margaret smiled. Few worthwhile things do in my experience. That evening, after the boys had gone and Hannah had retired to bed, Ethan sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. His back still ached, but the forced rest had already begun to help. Tomorrow the boys would return to finish the field, and by Monday, if weather permitted, he could begin planting. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something close to hope. With the field cleared and planted on time, the harvest might be good enough to make the bank payment. If the weather held and prices didn't drop further, they might just make it through another year. But it wasn't only hope for the farm that occupied his thoughts. Margaret Thompson's face kept appearing in his mind, her direct gaze, her confident smile, the way she challenged him without being unkind. It had been so long since he'd thought of a woman as anything other than Sarah's memory that the feelings confused him. Ethan stood carefully, testing his back as he made his way to Sarah's grave beneath the old elm tree at the edge of the property. He'd buried her there because she'd loved the view of the sunset from that spot. "I don't know what to do, Sarah," he said softly to the simple wooden cross. "There's this woman. She makes me feel things I thought had died with you. Is that a betrayal, or would you want me to find happiness again?" The night breeze stirred the leaves above him, but no answer came. Ethan hadn't expected one. Sarah was gone, and no amount of talking to her grave would bring her back or tell him what she would have wanted. But as he stood there beneath the stars, he remembered something Sarah had said during her final days when the fever had briefly broken and she'd been lucid. "Promise me you won't bury yourself with me, Ethan. Hannah will need a father who's truly alive, not just breathing." He hadn't understood what she meant then. He'd been focused on promising her she would recover, that there would be no need for such thoughts. But now, 3 years later, her words took on new meaning. He'd kept the farm going, provided for Hannah, done everything a responsible father should do. But he hadn't been truly living. He'd been surviving, going through the motions, working until exhaustion brought dreamless sleep. Perhaps Sarah had known him better than he knew himself. Perhaps she'd understood that without someone to remind him to rest, to enjoy simple pleasures, to connect with others, he would lose himself in endless work. As Ethan made his way back to the house, his steps were lighter despite the pain. Tomorrow was Sunday, and Margaret was coming for supper. For the first time in years, he was looking forward to something that had nothing to do with work or obligation. It felt like waking up after a long, dreamless sleep. Sunday dawned clear and mild, a perfect spring day. Ethan woke early, as was his habit, but instead of immediately heading outside to work, he took time preparing for the day ahead. He shaved carefully, trimmed his beard, and put on his good shirt, the one he usually saved for church. Hannah noticed immediately. "You look nice, Papa," she said, a hint of a smile playing at her lips. "It's Sunday," Ethan replied, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "We're not going to church today," Hannah reminded him. "You said your back needed rest." "We still have company coming," Ethan countered, busying himself with making coffee. Hannah's smile widened. "Miss Thompson will appreciate the effort." They spent the morning preparing for their guest. Hannah cleaned the house while Ethan, moving gingerly, tended to necessary chores around the barn. By afternoon, they had a chicken roasting, fresh bread cooling, and vegetables from last year's preserved stores ready to be prepared. Margaret arrived promptly at 4, driving her own buggy. She wore a simple dress of deep blue that complemented her eyes, her hair arranged more elegantly than Ethan had seen before. She carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Something smells wonderful," she said as Ethan helped her down from the buggy. "Hannah's been cooking all day," Ethan replied. "She's determined to impress you." "And what about you, Ethan?" Margaret asked, her eyes holding his. "Are you trying to impress me too?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. Well, I did put on a clean shirt." Margaret laughed, the sound warming something in Ethan's chest. "Honesty, I appreciate that in a man." As they walked toward the house, Margaret handed him the package. "A small gift for allowing me to intrude on your Sunday." Ethan unwrapped it to find a book, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. He ran his fingers over the leather cover, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Hannah mentioned you enjoy reading poetry in the evenings," Margaret explained. "She said your copy of Wordsworth was falling apart from use." "This is very kind," Ethan said, genuinely moved. Books were expensive luxuries, especially out here where every penny typically went to practical necessities. "Thank you." Inside, Hannah greeted Margaret with a hug, showing none of the reserve she typically displayed with adults from town. It was clear to Ethan that his daughter had formed a genuine attachment to her teacher. Dinner was the most pleasant meal Ethan had experienced in years. Margaret shared stories of her life in Boston, of her journey west, and of the amusing cultural misunderstandings she'd encountered in Texas. Hannah spoke animatedly about school and her friends, showing a side of herself that Ethan realized he rarely saw anymore, the carefree young girl rather than the solemn little woman who had taken on so many responsibilities. After the meal, they moved to the porch to enjoy the sunset. Hannah excused herself to finish an essay for school, leaving Ethan and Margaret alone. "Your daughter is remarkable," Margaret said, watching the golden light fade from the horizon. "She has such strength and kindness. You've raised her well." "Sarah deserves most of the credit," Ethan replied. "She laid the foundation. I've just tried not to ruin what she started." Margaret turned to face him. "You're too hard on yourself, Ethan. It can't have been easy raising a daughter alone while keeping this farm going." "It hasn't been," he admitted. "There are days I wonder if I'm doing right by her, if she wouldn't be better off with relatives back east, getting proper schooling and feminine guidance." "She gets an excellent education," Margaret said with mild indignation. "And as for feminine guidance, she seems to be developing into a thoughtful, capable young woman. What more could you want for her?" Ethan sighed. "I want her to have choices. Real choices, not just the narrow options available to women out here. Sarah and we had dreams for her college, maybe a life beyond Wilson." "Those dreams are still possible," Margaret assured him. "Hannah is bright enough for any college, and the world is changing, Ethan. Women have more opportunities now than ever before." "Out here?" Ethan asked skeptically. "Even out here," Margaret confirmed. "The frontier needs educated women as much as it needs strong men, perhaps more so. We bring civilization, culture, education." "Is that why you came, to civilize us rough Westerners?" Margaret laughed. "Hardly. I came because I wanted to matter. In Boston, I was just another unmarried woman of a certain age, pitied by friends and ignored by society. Here, what I do makes a difference. Every child I teach might have a better life because of the knowledge I share." Ethan studied her face in the fading light, struck by her passion and conviction. "You're not what I expected, Margaret Thompson. And what did you expect? I'm not sure," he admitted. "Someone more conventional, I suppose." "Conventional women rarely travel alone to frontier towns," Margaret pointed out. "It takes a certain stubbornness." "I've noticed that quality," Ethan said, smiling. They fell into comfortable silence as the first stars appeared. Ethan couldn't remember the last time he'd simply sat and enjoyed an evening without thinking about work or worrying about the future. Margaret's presence beside him felt right somehow, as if she belonged on his porch watching the Texas sunset. "Will you read something from your new book?" Margaret asked after a while. "I'd like to hear the words in your voice." Ethan hesitated. Reading aloud felt oddly intimate, but he found himself reaching for the book nonetheless. He opened it to a page at random and began to read. "This is what you shall do. Love the earth and sun and the animals, despise riches, give alms to everyone that asks, stand up for the stupid and crazy, devote your income and labor to others, hate tyrants, argue not concerning God." His voice grew stronger as he continued, the words resonating within him. When he finished the passage, he looked up to find Margaret watching him intently. "You read beautifully," she said softly. "I can see why Hannah said you love poetry." "It reminds me there's more to life than toil," Ethan explained. "Sarah used to read to me in the evenings while I mended harnesses or repaired tools. After she died, I started reading to myself. It helped, with the silence." Margaret reached over and touched his hand briefly. "The silence can be deafening when you're used to sharing your life with someone. You speak as if from experience," Ethan observed. Margaret's expression grew distant. "Before the war, I was engaged. James went to fight and never returned. They never even found his body." "I'm sorry," Ethan said, understanding now why she had chosen to leave Boston. The ghost of what might have been could haunt a place as surely as any spirit. "It was a long time ago," Margaret replied, though her eyes suggested the wound wasn't entirely healed. "But it helps me understand a little of what you've been through. The difference is you had the chance to build something with Sarah before losing her. You have Hannah. I only had dreams." Impulsively, Ethan reached for her hand. "Dreams matter too." Margaret looked down at their joined hands, then back to his face. "Yes, they do. Which is why you can't work yourself to death for this farm. What good is securing Hannah's future if you're not here to see it?" The concern in her voice touched something deep within Ethan. It had been so long since anyone had worried about him, had seen him as something more than just a farmer struggling to make ends meet. "I'm trying to learn that lesson," he said, reluctantly releasing her hand as he heard Hannah's approaching footsteps. The rest of the evening passed pleasantly, with Hannah joining them for a game of checkers before it was time for Margaret to leave. As Ethan helped her into her buggy, he found himself reluctant to see her go. Would you consider joining us again next Sunday?" he asked, surprising himself with the invitation. Margaret's smile lit up her face. "I'd like that very much." As he watched her drive away, Ethan realized that for the first time in years, he was looking forward to the week ahead, not just enduring it, but anticipating what it might bring. The following days established a new rhythm at the Powell farm. With the north field cleared by the church youth and Ethan's back slowly improving, he was able to begin planting with Hannah's help. In the afternoons, he forced himself to rest, often reading from the book Margaret had given him. True to her word, Margaret returned the following Sunday and the Sunday after that. Each visit brought new conversations, new discoveries about each other, and a growing ease between them. Hannah flourished under the additional female attention, confiding in Margaret about her hopes and interests in a way she hadn't with Ethan in years. By the fourth Sunday, the entire town was buzzing with speculation about the schoolteacher's regular visits to the Powell farm. Ethan became aware of this when Reverend Jenkins approached him after church with a knowing smile. "Miss Thompson seems to have taken quite an interest in your family," the Reverend observed. "She's been very kind to Hannah," Ethan replied cautiously. "And to Hannah's father, from what I hear," the Reverend added. "It's good to see you engaging with the community again, Ethan. You've kept to yourself too long." Word of Margaret's regular visits reached Mrs. Holloway, the town's most notorious gossip, who made a point of stopping Margaret on her way to school Monday morning. "Miss Thompson," Mrs. Holloway called, her voice sugary with false concern. "I wanted to speak with you about your situation." Margaret paused, adjusting her grip on her books. "My situation, Mrs. Holloway, your visits to the Powell farm have not gone unnoticed," Mrs. Holloway said. "A single woman spending so much time alone with a widower. Well, it raises eyebrows." Margaret's expression remained pleasant, but her voice took on a steel edge. "Mr. Powell's 15-year-old daughter is always present, Mrs. Holloway. There is nothing improper about friends sharing a Sunday meal." "Friends," Mrs. Holloway repeated skeptically. "Is that all it is? Because the school board is quite particular about the moral character of our teachers." Margaret stood straighter. "My moral character is beyond reproach, Mrs. Holloway, and while I appreciate your concern, my personal associations are my own business." With that, she continued toward the schoolhouse, her back straight and her steps determined. When Ethan heard about the encounter later that day from Mr. Wilson at the general store, his first instinct was to pull back, to protect Margaret's reputation. The last thing he wanted was to cause problems for her position in the community. That afternoon, he made the mile-long walk to the schoolhouse, waiting outside until the students had been dismissed. Margaret looked surprised to see him leaning against the hitching post. "Ethan," she said, pleasure and concern mingling in her voice, "is everything all right? Is it your back?" "My back is much better," he assured her. "I wanted to talk to you about something else. May I walk you home?" They fell into step together, the late April sunshine warm on their shoulders. "I heard about your encounter with Mrs. Holloway," Ethan began. "I'm sorry if my invitation has caused difficulties for you." Margaret's expression hardened slightly. "Mrs. Holloway doesn't decide whom I may visit." "No, but the school board might," Ethan pointed out. "I don't want to jeopardize your position here." "And what exactly are you suggesting?" Margaret asked, her voice carefully controlled. Ethan hesitated. "Perhaps it would be best if our Sunday gatherings were less regular, at least for a while." Margaret stopped walking and turned to face him directly. "Is that what you want, Ethan, or are you merely being noble?" The question caught him off guard. "I want what's best for you," he said finally. "That's not an answer," Margaret replied. "What do you want, Ethan Powell? Not what you think is proper or sensible or safe. What do you want?" No one had asked Ethan that question in years. He'd been so focused on survival, on obligation, on keeping promises, that his own desires had become irrelevant. "I want." He began, then faltered. The truth felt too vulnerable, too raw to speak aloud, but Margaret's steady gaze demanded honesty. I want to see you. I look forward to Sundays more than I can say. When you're at the farm, it feels right, like something that was missing has been found. The admission hung between them in the golden afternoon light. Margaret's expression softened, a smile slowly spreading across her face. Then that's what matters, she said simply. I feel the same way, Ethan, and I won't let small-minded gossip dictate my happiness. But your job is important to me, Margaret acknowledged. But so are you and Hannah. If the school board questions me, I'll face them honestly. I have nothing to be ashamed of. They continued walking, a new awareness between them. Ethan's hand brushed against Margaret's, and after a moment's hesitation, he took it in his. Her fingers intertwined with his, warm and sure. Besides, Margaret added with a mischievous smile, Mrs. Wilson is on the school board, and she told me just last week that she thinks you've been alone too long. I suspect I have more allies than Mrs. Holloway realizes. Ethan laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. Mrs. Wilson has been trying to marry me off since Sarah's funeral. I thought she'd given up. She's merely changed tactics, Margaret suggested, supporting our friendship rather than arranging formal introductions. Their eyes met, and both knew that what was growing between them had already moved beyond friendship, though neither was quite ready to name it yet. As May turned to June, the wheat in Ethan's fields grew strong and green, promising a good harvest if the weather held. His back continued to heal, though he was more careful now, pacing himself and allowing Hannah to help with chores that wouldn't strain her. Margaret's Sunday visits had become an established tradition, one that the town gossips eventually accepted as they moved on to fresher scandals. She often brought books or newspapers from back east, sharing news of the wider world over dinner. One Sunday in late June, Margaret arrived with a particularly thick envelope. I've had a letter from my mother, she explained as they sat on the porch after dinner. She's been corresponding with the dean of the Women's College in Boston. They're expanding their programs and actively seeking bright young women from across the country. Hannah, who had been listening nearby, looked up with sudden interest. A women's college? Yes, Margaret said, extracting a pamphlet from the envelope. They offer courses in literature, mathematics, natural sciences, a full education comparable to what men receive at Harvard or Yale. Hannah took the pamphlet, her eyes wide as she paged through it. Do you really think I could go to a place like this someday? With your mind? Absolutely, Margaret assured her. You're one of the brightest students I've ever taught. In fact, she hesitated, glancing at Ethan. There's a scholarship mentioned in the letter for promising students from Western states. Ethan watched his daughter's face illuminate with possibility. The cost of such an education had always made it seem an impossible dream, but a scholarship might change everything. It's still a few years away, Margaret continued. You'd need to finish your basic education here first, but it's something to consider to work toward. Later, after Hannah had gone to bed, still clutching the pamphlet, Ethan and Margaret sat alone on the porch swing. Thank you for that, Ethan said quietly, for showing her possibilities beyond Wilson. She deserves every opportunity, Margaret replied. She has such potential, Ethan. And such determination. Like her mother, Ethan said with a sad smile, Sarah always believed education was the key to a better life. She taught herself to read Latin from an old grammar book her father had owned. Hannah mentioned that, Margaret said. She also told me Sarah kept journals. That she was writing a history of the region. Ethan nodded. She interviewed the oldest settlers, recorded their stories. She wanted to preserve the true history, not just the official accounts. What happened to her work? Margaret asked. It's in a trunk in our bedroom, Ethan admitted. I haven't been able to bring myself to look at it since she died. Margaret laid her hand over his. Perhaps someday, when you're ready, it sounds like something that should be preserved, maybe even published. Published. Ethan had never considered this possibility. Why not? Women's accounts of frontier life are gaining interest back east. I have connections with a publisher in Boston through my father. If her work is as thorough as you describe, it might find an audience. The idea that Sarah's words might live on, might be read by others and valued, brought unexpected emotion to Ethan's throat. She would have liked that. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the porch swing creaking gently as they rocked. Fireflies began to appear in the gathering dusk, their tiny lights blinking in the yard. I love evenings like this, Margaret said softly. In Boston, we had gaslights and crowded streets. It's beautiful in its way, but there's something about the vastness of the sky here, the quiet broken only by natural sounds. It grows on you, Ethan agreed. When we first arrived, Sarah found it overwhelming, too much space, too much silence. But eventually she came to love it as much as I do. I understand both reactions, Margaret said. The first night in Wilson, I lay awake wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. Everything was so foreign, the sounds, the smells, the relentless heat. And now, Ethan asked. Margaret turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the last light of day. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else. The simple statement carried a weight that both recognized. This wasn't just about Margaret's adjustment to Texas. It was about the place she'd found for herself in Wilson, in the community, and in Ethan and Hannah's lives. I'm glad, Ethan said, his voice low. I can't imagine Sundays without you now. Margaret's smile was tender, just Sundays. Ethan took her hand. Any day, every day, the admission hung between them, more significant than any formal declaration. Margaret's fingers tightened around his. Ethan, she began, her voice uncertain for the first time since he'd known her. I need to know what this is between us. What you want it to be. Ethan took a deep breath, gathering courage. I want everything. More than I have any right to ask for. I want to court you properly, Margaret, with Hannah's blessing and the community's knowledge. I want to see if what I feel for you, what I think you might feel for me, could grow into something lasting. Margaret's eyes shone in the twilight. I would like that very much. With gentle hesitation, Ethan leaned forward and placed a soft kiss on her lips. It was brief and tender, a promise rather than a passion, but it sealed something between them that both had been feeling for weeks. As Margaret prepared to leave that evening, Ethan helped her into her buggy with a new sense of possibility. May I call on you Tuesday evening? He asked. Perhaps we could walk to the church social together, Margaret nodded, her smile radiant in the lantern light. I'll be waiting. As he watched her drive away, Ethan realized that his back barely troubled him anymore. The farm work that had once seemed an endless burden now felt manageable, partly because he'd learned to pace himself, and partly because he had something beyond work to look forward to. The wheat continued to grow, and with it, Ethan's hopes for the future. For the first time since Sarah's death, he allowed himself to think beyond mere survival to what happiness might look like, not just for Hannah, but for himself as well. July brought scorching heat and the constant worry of drought. Ethan watched the sky anxiously for clouds, knowing that the wheat needed rain to reach its full potential. The bank payment loomed in September, and everything depended on a good harvest. One particularly hot afternoon, as Ethan checked the irrigation channels in the south field, he spotted Margaret's buggy approaching. This was unusual. Her visits typically came on Sundays, and this was a Thursday. He made his way to the house, concern growing as he noted her agitated manner as she secured her horse. Margaret, is everything all right? She turned, her face flushed from the heat and something else, excitement or anxiety, he couldn't tell which. Ethan, she said, holding out an envelope. This arrived on today's post. It's from Boston, from the publisher I mentioned. Ethan took the envelope, noting it had already been opened. You wrote to them about Sarah's journals, Margaret nodded. After our conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I wrote describing what you'd told me about her work, the settler interviews, the historical documentation. I hope you don't mind. Ethan extracted the letter, his calloused fingers awkward with the fine paper. The message was brief but clear. Emerson and Wallace Publishing expressed interest in reviewing Sarah Powell's manuscript on frontier history, particularly given her unique perspective as a woman documenting settler experiences. They enclosed an advance payment of $50 to secure first review rights. $50, Ethan breathed, stunned by the amount. It was nearly half of what he needed for the bank payment. Just to look at her work. Historical accounts by women are rare, Margaret explained. Especially from the frontier. And with the country's centennial last year, there's renewed interest in America's expansion westward. Ethan stared at the check enclosed with the letter. I never thought. Sarah always said her writing was just for us, for keeping our family history. It could be more, Margaret said gently. It could be her legacy, Ethan, her voice continuing even though she's gone. The thought brought unexpected tears to Ethan's eyes. He turned away, embarrassed by the sudden emotion. Margaret stepped closer, her hand touching his arm. "You don't have to decide now," she said. "And if it feels wrong, we'll write back and decline. The journals belong to you and Hannah. It's your choice." Ethan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "No, it's the right thing. Sarah would have wanted her work to matter, to be read. I just never imagined that she might help save the farm even now," Margaret suggested. Ethan nodded, unable to speak. It seemed fitting somehow that Sarah, who had poured so much love into this land, might help preserve it through words written in stolen moments between chores and childrearing. That evening, after showing the letter to an ecstatic Hannah, Ethan finally opened the trunk containing Sarah's journals. The leather-bound books were carefully organized, each labeled by year and topic. Her handwriting filled page after page, clear, precise observations of frontier life, interviews with original settlers, descriptions of native plants and their uses, accounts of weather patterns and how they affected crops. "It's better than I remembered," Ethan said as he and Hannah paged through the journals. "More complete. She worked on it every night after you went to bed," Hannah revealed. "She said it was her gift to the future, to people who would never know what it was like to build something from nothing." Margaret, who had stayed to help them sort through the material, handled each journal with reverent care. "This is remarkable work," she said. "Not just historically valuable, but beautifully written. Your mother had a genuine gift, Hannah." Together, they selected the journals that seemed most relevant to the publisher's interests, focusing on the settler interviews and historical accounts rather than the more personal family entries. Ethan would copy these sections before sending the originals, ensuring that Sarah's words remained with them even if the journals traveled to Boston. The project gave the three of them a shared purpose beyond their Sunday gatherings. Margaret often came by in the evenings to help with the copying, her neat hand complementing Sarah's flowing script. Hannah threw herself into organizing the material, creating a catalog system that would help the publishers navigate the extensive collection. As they worked, Ethan found himself sharing stories about Sarah that he'd kept locked away for years: her determination to plant flowers even in the harshest drought, her ability to calm the most skittish colt, her talent for finding humor in the darkest situations. Speaking of her became easier with each passing day, the sharp pain of loss gradually transforming into tender remembrance. One evening in late July, as they worked at the kitchen table with the windows open to catch any stray breeze, Hannah paused in her cataloging. "Do you think Mama would like Miss Thompson, Papa?" The question caught Ethan by surprise. He glanced at Margaret, who had looked up from her copying with equal interest in his response. "I think she would," Ethan said carefully. "Your mother valued education and independence. She would have respected Margaret for making her own way in the world." Hannah nodded, seemingly satisfied. After a moment, she added, "I think she would want you to be happy again. She told me that once, when she was sick, she made me promise to remind you that living means more than just working." Ethan reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise," Hannah replied with a small smile. "You've just been too busy to notice." The three of them laughed, the sound filling the kitchen that had been too quiet for too long. As Ethan glanced at Margaret across the table, their eyes met in a moment of shared understanding. Whatever was growing between them had Hannah's blessing, the final permission Ethan had needed to fully open his heart again. August brought the first signs that their efforts might be rewarded. The wheat fields turned golden under the Texas sun, the heads heavy with grain. Though they hadn't received as much rain as Ethan had hoped, the crop looked better than it had in years. The bank had agreed to accept the publisher's advance as partial payment, with the remainder due after harvest. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to believe that they might keep the farm, that all his work hadn't been in vain. But the greatest change wasn't in the fields or the financial prospects. It was in the atmosphere of the house itself. What had once been merely shelter, a place to eat and sleep between bouts of work, had become a home again. Laughter echoed in rooms that had been silent too long. Books and papers covered the table where only practical items had been permitted before. The piano in the corner, untouched since Sarah's death, was opened and tuned, with Margaret teaching Hannah to play simple melodies in the evenings. As harvest approached, the entire community prepared for the busiest time of the year. Ethan, remembering the help he'd received with clearing the north field, offered his assistance to neighboring farms before his own wheat was ready. The work was still demanding, but he approached it differently now, pacing himself, accepting help when offered and making time for rest. "You've changed," Margaret observed one evening as they walked back from a community dance. Hannah had gone ahead with friends, giving them a rare moment alone. "How so?" Ethan asked, though he knew the answer. "You're lighter somehow," Margaret explained. "When I first met you, it was as if you carried the weight of the world on your shoulders. You never smiled. Now." She gestured to his face, where indeed a smile had formed without his awareness. "I have reasons to smile now," he said simply. Margaret took his hand as they walked, a gesture that had become natural between them. "It's more than that. You've learned to rest, Ethan, not just physically, but here." She touched his chest over his heart. "You're not fighting against life anymore, you're living it." Ethan considered this. "I still work hard." "Of course you do," Margaret agreed. "But work isn't all you do. You read. You talk with Hannah about her dreams instead of just her chores. You come to community gatherings. You court a certain schoolteacher." This last was said with a teasing smile. "The most challenging work of all," Ethan replied, returning her smile. "Keeping up with your intellect exhausts me more than plowing ever did." Margaret laughed, the sound carrying in the quiet evening. "Flattery, Mr. Powell. Simple truth, Miss Thompson." They had reached the small house Margaret rented near the school. As they stood on her porch, Ethan felt the same anticipation he'd experienced during their first kiss. 3 months of courtship had deepened his feelings beyond anything he'd expected to find again in this life. "Margaret," he began, his voice serious, "I've been thinking about the future, about what happens after harvest." She tilted her head, waiting for him to continue. "If all goes well, if we make the bank payment and secure the farm, I'd like to make some changes. To the house, to the way we live." "What kind of changes?" Margaret asked. Ethan took both her hands in his. "The kind that would make room for you if you wanted it. If you could imagine a life with a farmer and his half-grown daughter." Margaret's eyes widened. "Ethan Powell, are you proposing to me on my front porch?" "Not very well, apparently," Ethan said with a nervous laugh. "I had a speech prepared. It was going to be after harvest, with flowers, and Margaret silenced him with a kiss, rising on her toes to press her lips firmly against his. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Yes," she said simply. "I can imagine that life very clearly. In fact, I've been imagining little else for months." Ethan pulled her close, his heart full to bursting. "I love you, Margaret. I never thought I'd say those words to anyone again, but I do. I love your mind, your spirit, your kindness to Hannah, your stubbornness." "My stubbornness?" Margaret interrupted, laughing. "Especially your stubbornness," Ethan affirmed. "It's what brought you to Wilson, what made you notice a broken-down farmer who didn't know how to rest." Margaret touched his face gently. "You weren't broken, Ethan, just tired, so very tired. And I love you too, your strength, your gentleness, your dedication, even your occasional pig-headedness." They sealed their understanding with another kiss, longer and deeper than before. When they finally parted, Ethan felt as though something fundamental had shifted in his world, as if all the pieces of a puzzle had finally fallen into place. "We should wait to tell Hannah," he said as he reluctantly prepared to leave, "until after harvest, until we know for certain about the farm." Margaret nodded her agreement. "That seems wise, though I suspect she already knows how we feel about each other." "She's observant," Ethan acknowledged, "and as she recently informed me, she's always been wise." With a final kiss goodnight, Ethan began the walk home, his steps lighter than they had been in years. The future that had once seemed an endless struggle now held promise and joy. The farm that had been a burden might become the foundation for a new family, a new beginning. As he approached his property, Ethan paused to look at the fields of ripening wheat, silvered by moonlight. The land that he and Sarah had claimed with nothing but hope and determination had sustained them through drought and hardship. It had seen birth and death, joy and sorrow. Now it would witness renewal. For the first time, Ethan could see beyond the next harvest, beyond the next payment. He could imagine Margaret in Sarah's kitchen garden, Hannah returning from college for holidays, perhaps someday children running through fields where once he had worked alone until his back gave out. The harvest began in early September, earlier than usual due to the hot, dry summer. The entire community mobilized, moving from farm to bring in the crops before storms could damage the ripened grain. Ethan's wheat was scheduled for the third week, with neighbors promising to help just as he had helped them. The night before his harvest was to begin, Ethan sat with Hannah on the porch, both too excited to sleep despite the exhausting days of work on other farms. "If the yield is as good as it looks, we'll make the payment with some to spare," Ethan said, calculating mentally. "And with what the publisher has promised for your mother's journals, we might even have enough to make improvements to the house before winter." "For Margaret?" Hannah asked with a knowing smile. Ethan looked at his daughter in surprise. "How did you know?" Hannah rolled her eyes in a gesture that reminded him forcefully of Sarah. "Papa, everyone knows. Mrs. Wilson has been planning your wedding menu for weeks." "Has she now?" Ethan laughed. "And how do you feel about that possibility?" Hannah's expression grew serious. "I want you to be happy, Papa." "And Miss Thompson, Margaret, she makes you happy. I see it every time you look at her." "She does," Ethan acknowledged. "But you come first, Hannah, always." "I know," Hannah said, leaning against his shoulder as she had when she was small, "but I won't always be here. If I get that scholarship to Boston." "When you get that scholarship," Ethan corrected gently. Hannah smiled. "When I get it, I'll be gone for months at a time. I don't want to think of you here alone, working yourself to exhaustion with no one to remind you to rest." "I've learned that lesson," Ethan assured her, "but you're right. The thought of you going so far away would be harder without Margaret here." "Then it's settled," Hannah said with satisfaction. "You'll ask her properly after harvest, and she'll say yes because she's not blind to a good thing and we'll be a family again." The simple confidence in her voice moved Ethan deeply. "When did you become so grown up?" "When Mama died," Hannah answered honestly. "Someone had to make sure you remembered to live." Ethan hugged his daughter close, marveling at the strength and wisdom in one so young. Sarah would have been proud of the woman Hannah was becoming, practical yet compassionate, determined yet kind. So much like her mother, and yet entirely her own person. The harvest exceeded even Ethan's cautious hopes. The wheat yielded well despite the dry summer, and the price per bushel had risen slightly due to poor harvests further north. When the last wagon was loaded and the final calculations made, Ethan knew they had enough to make the full bank payment with money remaining for home improvements and a small reserve for emergencies. The community celebrated with a harvest festival in the town square. Tables groaned with food prepared by every household, and lanterns hung from trees cast a golden glow over the gathering. A fiddler played lively tunes, and children darted between adults in impromptu games of tag. Ethan found Margaret by the lemonade table, looking particularly lovely in a green dress that complemented her eyes. Hannah had insisted on staying in town with her that afternoon to prepare for the festival, and the results were evident in Margaret's elegantly arranged hair and the sprig of wildflowers pinned to her bodice. "You look beautiful," Ethan said, offering her a cup of lemonade. "Thank you," Margaret replied, her eyes taking in his own carefully pressed shirt and newly trimmed beard. "You look rather handsome yourself." They moved through the festival together, stopping to chat with neighbors and friends. Ethan noticed with amusement that no one seemed surprised to see them together. Hannah had been right. Their courtship was apparently common knowledge. As the evening progressed and the music grew more spirited, Ethan led Margaret away from the crowd, toward the quieter area near the church. The harvest moon hung low and full in the sky, bathing everything in soft silver light. "I have something to ask you," Ethan said when they were alone. "Something I've been waiting to ask until the harvest was in." Margaret's smile was expectant. "I believe I know what it is." Ethan took her hands in his. "Margaret Thompson, you came to Wilson and changed everything for the town, for Hannah, for me. You taught me that there's more to life than endless work, that rest isn't weakness, that joy is still possible even after loss." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. From it, he extracted a ring, a simple gold band set with a small pearl. "This was my mother's," he explained. "I'd be honored if you would wear it as my wife. If you would make our house a home again, help me raise Hannah, share whatever years were granted together." Margaret's eyes shone in the moonlight. "Nothing would make me happier, Ethan." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Ethan felt a sense of rightness, of completion. The journey from their first meeting, when he'd been a stubborn, exhausted farmer unwilling to rest, to this moment of promise and new beginning, seemed both improbable and inevitable. Their kiss was interrupted by a whoop of joy as Hannah, who had apparently been watching from nearby, rushed forward to embrace them both. "Finally," she exclaimed, hugging Margaret fiercely. "I was beginning to think Papa would never get around to asking." Margaret laughed, returning Hannah's embrace. He was waiting for the right moment and for the harvest to be secured. "Always practical," Hannah said with mock exasperation, "both of you." The three of them walked back to the festival together, Hannah between them, chattering excitedly about wedding plans and house improvements, and how they would tell everyone, though, as Ethan observed wryly, it appeared most people already knew. The news was officially announced at the festival's end, when Reverend Jenkins called for everyone's attention to thank God for the successful harvest. He added with a broad smile that they had another blessing to celebrate: the engagement of Miss Margaret Thompson to Mr. Ethan Powell, with a wedding planned for late October after the fall planting. The cheer that went up from the gathered community warmed Ethan's heart. These people who had given him space to grieve, who had helped when his back gave out, who had welcomed Margaret despite her Eastern ways, they were as much a part of his life as the land itself. Later that night, as Ethan walked Margaret home, they made plans for the future. The small bedroom that had been used for storage would be cleaned out for Hannah. The main bedroom would be repainted and the floors refinished. The kitchen garden would be expanded, and perhaps next spring they might add a room to the house if funds allowed. What about the school? Ethan asked suddenly. "Will you continue teaching after we're married?" Margaret considered the question. "For this year at least. There's no one else to take my place, and the children need education, but perhaps next year if the school board can find a replacement. I'd like to focus on our home, on helping with the farm, and on editing Sarah's journals for publication," Ethan added. "The publishers were very clear about wanting your continued involvement." "Yes, that too," Margaret agreed. "It's important work, preserving her voice, her observations. It's a gift to history and to Hannah." As they reached Margaret's house, Ethan kissed her goodnight with the knowledge that soon these partings would end. Soon they would build a life together, not erasing the past, but honoring it while creating something new. The October wedding was simple but joyful, held in the white clapboard church where Ethan had once sat numbly through Sarah's funeral. Now the building was transformed with autumn flowers and ribbon, the pews filled with friends rather than mourners. Hannah stood beside Margaret as her attendant, while Reverend Jenkins performed the ceremony with evident pleasure. Ethan, watching Margaret walk toward him in a dress of deep blue velvet, not white, she had insisted, as this was a new beginning rather than a first love, felt a complex emotion that combined gratitude for the past with hope for the future. The vows they exchanged were traditional but deeply felt. When Ethan promised to cherish Margaret till death do us part, he did so with full awareness of what that commitment meant, both its joys and its sorrows. When Margaret promised to stand beside him in plenty and in want, she did so having seen both conditions and fearing neither. The celebration afterward, held at the Powell farm, brought together the entire community. Tables set up in the yard held food contributed by every household. The barn had been cleared for dancing, with the same fiddler from the Harvest Festival providing lively music. As evening fell and lanterns were lit, Ethan found a moment alone with his new wife on the porch where they had shared so many conversations. "Are you happy?" he asked, still sometimes disbelieving that this extraordinary woman had chosen him, had chosen their life together. "Completely," Margaret assured him, her hand finding his. "It feels like coming home, Ethan, like I've found where I belong after searching for so long." Later that night, after the guests had departed, and Hannah had gone to her new room, Ethan and Margaret stood in the bedroom that had been transformed for their new life together. The walls were freshly painted, the bedding new, the furniture rearranged, familiar but different, like their relationship itself. "Welcome home," Ethan said softly, drawing Margaret into his arms. "Home," she repeated, the word full of meaning. "I think I've been looking for this my entire life." As they came together as husband and wife, The past did not disappear but took its proper place, honored but no longer dominant, a foundation rather than a barrier. The love they found in each other was not a replacement for what had been lost but a new creation, unique and precious in its own right. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys. The publication of Sarah's journals was a success beyond anyone's expectations, bringing not only financial security but also recognition of her contribution to frontier history. Margaret's careful editing and introductory essays provided context that made the work accessible to Eastern readers, and Sarah Powell's name became known in academic circles interested in Western expansion. Hannah received the scholarship to the Women's College in Boston, departing in the fall of 1878 with trunks packed by Margaret and financial security provided by her mother's unexpected literary legacy. Her letters home were full of excitement about classes, new friends, and the cultural opportunities of the city. She returned each summer, bringing books and ideas and stories that expanded their understanding of the changing world beyond Wilson. Margaret continued teaching for 2 more years before retiring to focus on their growing family. Their son, James Samuel Powell, was born in the spring of 1879, followed by twin girls, Sarah and Elizabeth, in 1881. The house expanded to accommodate them, with rooms added and the porch extended to provide more space for summer evenings and Sunday gatherings. Ethan still worked hard. The farm demanded no less, but he learned to work differently. He hired help when needed rather than pushing himself beyond endurance. He took time to read to his children in the evenings, to attend community events, to simply sit with Margaret and watch the sunset. His back troubled him occasionally, especially when storms approached, but he had learned to listen to his body's warnings rather than fighting through pain. And on the days when the old injury flared despite his precautions, Margaret was there with the same words that had first broken through his stubborn self-reliance. "Rest, Ethan. The chores will wait." In the spring of 1886, 10 years after Margaret had first come to Wilson, Hannah returned from Boston not just for a visit but to stay. She had completed her education and secured a position teaching at the newly established high school in the county seat, just 15 miles from the farm. She brought with her not only her diploma, but also a young professor of agriculture she had met at a lecture series, a man who looked at Hannah with the same admiration Ethan felt when he gazed at Margaret. On the day Hannah introduced David Mitchell to her family, Ethan and Margaret exchanged a knowing glance. The cycle was continuing, life building upon life, love creating new possibilities just as their love had done a decade before. That evening, as they sat on the expanded porch watching their children play in the yard, Ethan took Margaret's hand, the gesture as natural as breathing after years together. "Did you ever imagine this?" he asked, gesturing to the scene before them, the thriving farm, the children, Hannah's glowing face as she talked with David near the old oak tree. "Not the details," Margaret admitted, "but the feeling. Yes, I always hoped to find this sense of belonging, of purpose." Ethan nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. They had built something precious together, not just a farm or a family, but a life rich with meaning and connection. As the Texas sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Ethan thought of how far they had come from that first meeting, when he'd been a man who worked until his back gave out and she'd been the woman who dared to tell him to rest. The journey had not always been easy, but every step had led them here, to this moment of quiet contentment, to the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. "I love you, Margaret Powell," Ethan said, the words no less true for having been spoken countless times before. Margaret's smile, still capable of quickening his heart after all these years, was tender as she replied, "And I love you, Ethan Powell. Today, tomorrow, and all the days were granted." As darkness fell and they called the children in for supper, Ethan reflected that this was what Sarah had meant when she'd asked him to remain truly alive. Not merely surviving, working, enduring, but living fully, loving deeply, finding joy in both work and rest, in both giving and receiving. It had taken Margaret to teach him that lesson, to show him that strength lay not in relentless toil but in knowing when to pause, when to accept help, when to simply be present in the moment. The chores would always be there tomorrow. But tonight was for family, for love, for the life they had built together. And Ethan wouldn't have traded it for anything in the world.